Hello, and welcome to another episode of Transforming Business with me, Marvin Schneider. In this podcast series, I talk about all things business transformation, but not any generic kind of business transformation. The kind of transformation I'm talking about is the deep-rooted, broad-based, fundamental transformation from the boardroom down to the shop floor to enable companies, corporations to create wealth, sustainable wealth on an ongoing basis in ways that enhance the well-being of the individual, the wider community, and the environment. And so that as a objective, a corporate objective to create wealth in ways that enhance societal well-being is a very uplifting objective. And in this episode, I'm going to be describing the paradigm shift. And so if we're going to describe a paradigm shift, we need to understand what the current paradigm is and what the alternative, more sustainable, more inclusive paradigm is, and describe some of the benefits of the shift. But in a lot of ways, if the motivation to move from the current paradigm to the alternative paradigm requires proof of benefit in the minds of business leaders, those people that are in a position of influence, in a lot of ways, we've already lost the battle. And so in a previous episode, in fact, the immediate previous episode, I talked about higher consciousness in business and having to think from a higher vantage point. And when I say higher vantage point in that way, I mean thinking well beyond the primal human nature, at least historically, of fear, greed, self-interest, power, control, those kinds of things. And if you think about what a lot of businesses, or the way that a lot of businesses operate, they do operate in that very primal mode. And so we need to fundamentally shift the paradigm. So let's get to the topic. So for at least the last 50 years, probably beginning from about the early 1970s, the predominant corporate governance and therefore business paradigm revolved around what is often described as the shareholder primacy paradigm. And this was popularized by the American economist Milton Friedman back in, I think it was the early 1970s. And I've got a website in front of me, and I'm going to read aspects of it. It comes from the website, the Corporate Finance Institute website, corporatefinance.com. And if you search for the Friedman doctrine, for those that aren't familiar with it, you can. There's a very simple summary there, and I'm going to read small extracts of it just to give people a sense as to where we're coming from. And the interesting thing is that this whole Friedman doctrine was developed in response to what those business academics often describe as the agency issue, or the agency problem, or the agency conundrum, which basically emerges from the separation between the owners of the business and the managers of the business. And so when you have professional managers of a business which are not their owners, the fundamental question is, what is the corporate governance framework around which the owners should act? Sorry, the managers should act, and how should those actions lay out in relation to the owners? So for a lot of very large companies, they're publicly traded, listed on stock exchanges, and therefore owners are a collection of shareholders, each of which has a small shareholding in the assets and the, if you like, the dividends, the benefits of the operations of the company. In subsequent episodes, I'm going to talk about shareholders and investors and the role of the investment community in facilitating the paradigm shift that I'm going to describe, but that's for later. So the Milton Friedman doctrine basically said that the primary purpose, or in fact, it even gets worse than that. And let me just quote, that's probably the best way to do this. An entity's greatest responsibility lies in the satisfaction of the shareholders. Very blanket statement. And that is the fundamental essence of the shareholder primacy paradigm. And he says, and therefore the business should always endeavor to maximize its revenue to increase returns for shareholders. And there's a couple, extra layers to that. But what it also says quite specifically is that managers who are acting on behalf of shareholders should have no concern regarding social responsibility, and therefore the social responsibility or consequence of the corporation's activities rests on the shoulders of shareholders. So, the board, the CEO, and the executive team should have no concern regarding social responsibility. Now, that's an interesting statement. And I'm going to just sort of come back to that a little bit, because I'm not advocating for, corporate social responsibility. There was a movement 1 or 2 decades ago around corporate social responsibility, and there's a sort of an offshoot movement sometime later around shared value. And so I'm kind of not that excited about either of those things, because to a large degree, they are sort of band-aids around a fundamental problem. And so I'm not interested in band-aid fixes. I'm interested in fundamental shifts in the corporate paradigm. And it's very possible. And not only is it possible, it's an imperative. So, and we're going to kind of get to that over many subsequent episodes. So where did I want to go with this? The problem with the Milton doctrine and the problem with maximizing profit for the benefit of shareholders is that it taps into the most toxic and corrosive primal human motivations around self-interest, greed, power, dominance, inequity. And it really does lead to really poor outcomes for the individual, the wider community, and the environment. And I'm not going to describe them all. In fact, an interesting thing that I'd encourage is those that are watching this video on LinkedIn, please comment or write a comment and describe for the reader, the broader reader, the kinds of poor outcomes that you see deriving from corporate activities that are dominated or rooted in the maximization of short-term profit to the exclusion of other concerns. And particularly as it relates to the individual, the wider community, and the environment. You're going to hear me refer to those 3 groups a lot because they're all encompassing. So there is a problem with the Friedman doctrine. There is a problem with shareholder primacy, but unfortunately, a lot of directors and chairs are heavily grounded in the shareholder primacy paradigm. And they are even those that have an inkling that there is a purpose to the corporation beyond mere maximization of shareholder returns at any and all costs. Even those that have that inkling that there is something more to this they find themselves in an intractable position because they don't want to be the first mover and they don't want to lose their job. And, and so there's a lot of status, protection of the status quo. And to be honest, there are a small number of people that are so vested in inequality and, wealth to the exclusion of others that they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Now, to that cohort of people, there's really nothing that you can say to them that will sort of motivate them to shift, other than, as my wife reminds me from time to time, the primary motivation for change is pain. And until you get to a point of, being excessive pain, some people will not move, will not change. And so the pain comes at a point in the future, and I don't know what the tipping point is. My sense is that we're getting closer. Is it 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, 10 years? I don't know. I don't have that crystal ball, but I do have a very strong sense that we're getting to a tipping point where those people and those companies that do not undertake this transformation process will become increasingly irrelevant in the eyes of their customers, and therefore their businesses will ultimately fail. They will destroy shareholder value. They will implode, collapse, and they'll have their own Kodak moment. So I can't prove this to you, and I know it's not a motivating argument, but I have a strong sense that there will come that tipping point. And so for those that have any sort of higher purpose, higher consciousness mindset, there's a real opportunity right here, right now, to start the process. And please get in contact with me, because I know a lot about this. I've been working on this for decades. So let me just talk about that for a little bit. I mean, I'm not the only one. As much as I've been sort of talking about this and working on it for a long time, I'm not the only one advocating and even agitating for a shift in business paradigm. And I want to give you just a few examples. There are many. I'm not going to cover them all, but a gentleman by the name of George Seraphim, he's from Harvard Business School, recently put out his new book called Purpose Plus Profit. I actually saw that come up on my LinkedIn feed, and I actually commented on his LinkedIn post. So George, if you're watching this, please get in contact with me, because we're working on the same agenda, maybe from slightly different aspects, but it's kind of really important that you do get in contact with me. And then, of course, a few years earlier, there was Colin Mayer, who's from the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. He wrote a very good book called Prosperity, which talked about a lot of the historical context from an academic point of view for shifting away from shareholder primacy. And one of the interesting things that he said in his book is that the purpose of governance is the governance of purpose. And that resonated with me, because I've been talking about purpose for decades. And if you're not clear about purpose, then you've got a problem to begin with. The other thing is that if you have a mindset that the purpose of the corporation is to satisfy the sole interests of shareholders, that's a problem. Of course, there's another and a question around it, which is which shareholders and over what time frame. And a lot of the answer or the resolution to the perceived conflict of interest between a wider group of stakeholders and shareholders rests on those two questions. Which shareholders do I have a duty, fiduciary duty towards, and over what time frame? And then how will those interests be prosecuted? And my primary point is that the only way you can create wealth in any sustainable and ongoing way is when you do enhance the well-being of the individual, the wider community, and the environment. And I'm going to talk a lot about that and the nuance of that in following episodes. So, so we talked about George Seraphim and his Purpose Plus Profit book. It's a new book, brand new. We talked about Colin Mayer and Prosperity. There's also Raj Sisodia and John Mackey, who probably a decade earlier wrote a book called Conscious Capitalism. and even created a little bit of a movement around conscious capitalism, which is great. It's sort of it's dealing sort of in the domain. And then famously in 2019, the US Business Roundtable, which, and we just need to understand this, the US Business Roundtable is a not-for-profit lobbyist organization. I think they operate lobbying predominantly in Washington, D.C. in the US, but they represent the CEOs of big business, and they represent the interests of those big businesses. So they're not they're not here to uplift humanity. They really are a lobbyist organization in the full sense of that word, or that notion. But in 2019, there was a declaration amending the definition of the purpose of a corporation as participating in what they described as stakeholder capitalism. Now, there's been a lot of blowback and criticism. And by the way, that declaration was signed more recently by at least 200 CEOs of some of the largest organizations in the US. So there's been a lot of criticism around that being, it was a vacuous statement, right? So it's kind of like a feel-good thing, but it really hasn't motivated any fundamental change in approach. So as much as I've been talking about this for at least 2 decades, and many other people have been talking about it, it kind of begs the question, why hasn't the change already happened? And I think part of the answer is that a lot of people who are trying to make a move, and those that are affected by this shift in business paradigm, are locked into a thinking process and a consciousness process, and they're addressing the issue at the same level of consciousness as the problem was created in the first place. And Albert Einstein is often quoted as saying that you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness or thinking that created the problem in the first place. It's not entirely clear to me that that is an accurate attribution to Albert Einstein. I actually did do a little bit of research on a lot of his quotes, and as much as it's repeated that it is an Albert Einstein quote, it's not entirely clear to me that it is, but it doesn't matter because the sentiment is there. So a lot of people and a lot of groups, and those that are affected by this kind of debate, are they're locked in the mire of thinking about the problem and addressing the issue at the same level of consciousness that created the problem in the first place. And so what's needed here is to raise your vantage point and fundamentally think about the issue and the resolution of the issue from a completely different perspective. And that's what this shift in business paradigm is that I'm going to be describing. So here's this. I think the fundamental question that every board and executive team needs to address is every decision that they make in relation to their products and services, the way that they are created, so manufactured if it's a manufactured good, or in other ways, the way that they're distributed, right? So the nature of the product and service, the way that they are produced and then distributed, they need to fundamentally think about how that combination of activity enhances the well-being of the individual, the wider community, and the environment. And if anything that you're proposing to do does not enhance the well-being of the individual, wider community, and the environment, that's your gauge that you probably shouldn't do it. So and so the fundamental shift in thinking here is not how do I maximize revenue and profit in the short term. So maximize revenue by producing more products and services and marketing them more so that there is more consumption of a whole bunch of stuff that people probably don't either need or want. At one level, of course, they want it because they're buying it. But, so it's not, the question is not, doing more of something, getting people to buy more of it and producing it at the lowest cost, minimizing the cost. That's not the mindset. The mindset needs to be, what am I going to do? And how does that enhance the well-being of the individual, wider community, and the environment? And then the subsequent question, and it really is the second question, not the first order question. The second question is, how do I make sufficient amount of money from that endeavor so as to create an appropriate amount of wealth? And nowhere in that conversation did you hear me use the word maximize. The word maximization implies two things. One is more is always better, and that's just simply not true. And I'm going to address that issue in a future episode. So more, it's dominated in the mindset that more is always better, and I want all of that more now. I want it now, not tomorrow. So it's short-term maximization. More is better. And when that is your mindset, then you will do anything and everything with very little, if no regard at all, to the interests and the consequences to the individual, the wider community, and the environment. Let me give you one example of how this ends up playing out. In 2017, in Australia, we had a royal commission. All right. So this is a high-level judicial commission administered by a royal commissioner, a judge, and barristers. And it's no joke. People get subpoenaed. It's on record. It's not a flaky sort of Senate inquiry. It is full-on teeth in the whole judicial process in Australia. So in 2017, we had a royal commission into the banking and financial system in Australia. And here's the thing. The terms of reference for that royal commission included the term misconduct. And let me read, I've got a chapter excerpt in front of me of a book that I'm writing called Turning Point with my wife. And let me just quickly read what's down here. On the 14th of December, 2017, the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, so the Governor-General is the Queen's representative in Australia, His Excellency General, the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, was appointed a royal commissioner to inquire into, here we go, the misconduct in the banking, superannuation, and financial services industry. Misconduct. And so misconduct not only is going at the edges of ethics and morality, misconduct is getting to the primary issue of legality and illegality. And so when you've got a high number of royal commissions, inquiries, Senate inquiries, other judicial inquiries, hearings into the activities of large corporates, we've got a problem. So anyone that is saying, hey, there's nothing to see here, there's no problem, so we don't need to fix it, I think you really need to just think about that for a second. Okay. There's a couple of other things that I want to say in this episode, and then we'll wind it down. And again, I'm going to read from this chapter extract that I've done from the book that I'm writing at the moment. It's not out yet, but anyone that's interested in getting the extract, I think it's pretty good. So please email me. This is what I write. Perhaps the most fundamental question that a board needs to ask itself there's 4 or 5 questions. So number 1 is, what is the purpose of our company? And chairs and boards need to contemplate that question at a very deep level. And if the answer to that question is not something that is grounded in a noble intent to create, to conceive, produce, and distribute products and services that enhance the well-being of the individual, the wider community, and the environment. And there is objective understanding as to how those products and services and the way that they are produced and distributed enhance the well-being of the individual, wider community, and the environment, then you're on shaky foundation right there and then. So the first fundamental question that a board needs to ask is, what is the purpose of our company? And that purpose, if it's not grounded in a noble intent, you're already on shaky foundations. The second question is, what is the board's role in setting the conditions necessary to achieve that purpose? So the board has a governance role, and Colin Meyer said that the purpose of governance is the governance of purpose. So that makes a whole lot of sense. But the governance process needs to set the conditions necessary to achieve purpose. In other words, the board needs to set the governance foundations for long-term success, because it's only when you set that for long-term success that you can create wealth in any sustainable way on an ongoing basis, which, by the way, is what shareholders want, at least institutional shareholders. And I'm going to get to that in another episode. So what is the board's role in setting the conditions necessary to achieve that purpose? And when you contemplate that question, you're going to get a sense that a lot of governance architecture and the way that boards operate probably aren't fit for that purpose, and they need to be rethought, because a lot of governance process is all about compliance. It's less about setting the conditions for success or setting the conditions to achieve a stated corporate purpose. So the board has a very important role to play. The next question is, how can the board ensure that management is faithfully and effectively acting on that purpose? Now, I've been a strategy consultant and operating, at sort of top echelons in the consulting environment for quite a while, immediately after my MBA. And I see a lot of the information that boards use to govern the corporation. I honestly do not know how boards can effectively govern with the volume and nonsense of the information that they're getting. There's a lot of work to be done on that. So that question is, how can the board be sure that management is faithfully and effectively acting on the purpose? The next question is, what is the nature of the transformation required in order to transition to that purpose? Because I start from the premise that 99% of corporations around the world, the 16,500 very large listed companies, let alone all the very large private companies, probably are not operating within the paradigm that I'm describing, right? So, the vast majority, and I'm just going to throw 99% out there, the vast majority of companies are going to need to transition from what they're currently doing to what they should be doing to set themselves up for long-term success and create wealth on an ongoing basis in ways that enhance societal well-being. So what is the nature of the transformation required in order to transition to that purpose, and over what time frame should that transformation take place? Now, the fundamental transformation that I'm talking about is, it's not tinkering at the edges. So it is large-scale transformation, and therefore it will take time. And the board needs to basically get a view as to how much transformation they're going to take over what time frame, in a way that still allows the corporation to operate during the transition period. Now, I know that transitions of this nature are incredibly challenging. And that's why I've spent a couple of decades putting together a whole package of frameworks, capabilities, digital assets, tools, understandings for a systematic approach that any large corporate can adopt in navigating through this transformation process. And I'm going to talk about that in another episode. The final question on this is, how should the board engage with its institutional investors to ensure their support during the transformation process? So it's incredibly important that the board gets the engages with their institutional investors to let them know their intent to transform and what the long-term benefit is, knowing that during the transformation process, there might be a little bit of pain. And I'm going to talk about that in another episode as well. But it's in relation to that last question that it's vitally important that those that are in a leadership position within the institutional investment community get on board with this program as well. And I've got a whole response directed towards institutional investors as well. I can't understate how critically important it is for institutional investors to do two things. I mean, lots of things need to change within the investment community, but they fundamentally need to be doing two things. Number one is that they need to be agitating for and putting pressure on boards to undertake the transformation. Otherwise, they are going to disinvest. Right? So that's the first thing. There's a real, it's really important that institutional investors actually put the pressure on the board to make the change. Otherwise, they're going to sit there and the standard response is, well, you know, my shareholders don't care. No, your institutional shareholders should care, they will care, and they have an obligation to put pressure on the board to make the change or suffer the consequences. There you go. So that's the first thing. They need to put pressure on the boards to make the change. The next thing that they need to do is they need to support the board during the change process. In other words, they need to keep investing. They need to keep providing the funds. They need to keep voting for the transformation process. And they need to make sure that the transformation process isn't hijacked by the self-interests of hedge funds and various others. So they've got a really important role to play. So that's that. Then there's a bit of a corollary to this, and I'm just going to, again, I'm reading from the document, the extract, and then we'll wind out this episode. So knowing that the transformation is extensive, it might take 5 to 7 years to complete, but it needs to be completed in some structured way, all right? And that's really important. And the good news is that there is a structured way, and I can help boards, CEOs, senior executives with that. That's what I'm here to do. Okay, so they're going to need to do a number of things. One is to fundamentally rethink their purpose, and we've kind of already spoken about that. The next thing that they need to do here is they need to recognize which aspects of their existing business model are no longer fit for purpose. Now, the practical reality is the vast majority of organizations will have aspects of their business model, and possibly the vast majority of their current business model is actually not fit for purpose. And so you need to be really honest, and you need to recognize which aspects of your current business model are no longer fit for purpose. And that might include which products shouldn't be produced. Now, you get the severity of what's going on here. The next thing is that they need to envisage and then implement a bold new, I'm going to call it a strategy, but the word that I use is participation strategy, which is basically what am I in the business to do? In other words, what are the products and services that I'm going to make available for, customers, consumers to benefit from? So they need to envisage and then implement a bold new participation strategy. And then they need to transition away from the old paradigm participation strategy. And that's going to be the hardest thing, is to transition away from those things which are just, you shouldn't be doing. That's going to be the hardest thing, but it's important that they do that. So you need to envisage the new participation strategy and transition away from the old participation strategy. Then they need to invest to develop the new products and services that are truly worthy in the eyes of consumers and customers. In other words, it's truly beneficial to them. So you need to invest, and then you need to develop ways to produce and distribute those products and services to minimize harm and ultimately enhance the well-being of the individual, wider community and environment. Now, look, let's be clear about something. All human activity has some negative impacts on the environment. And so, unless we're all going to sort of, retreat to living in caves and whatever, that's just a fundamental reality. But we need to think about if the environmental degradation to doing something is so great, you got to ask the question whether we should be doing it. So I'm just going to put that out there. So that's a lot to mull over. Hope you enjoyed the episode. A lot of the upcoming episodes are going to be real punchy, hard-hitting. So, and it's important that I have these conversations, and they won't be necessarily palatable to everyone. So a lot of people will be challenged and confronted by it because it's so, it's revolutionary is not the right word, but it's so, expansive, but it has to be done. We don't have a lot of time. Please, if you're in a position of influence in the business or investment communities, please get in contact with me. It's really important. And then we're going to build an ecosystem of individuals and organizations that's going to sort of carry forward the momentum, because it needs to be broad-based. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So thanks for listening. Please like, share, subscribe, comment. Let me know in the comments examples that you think in which there are poor outcomes for individuals, wider community, and the environment from current business practice under the current shareholder primacy paradigm. And please definitely share. It's really important that these messagings get out there and they don't get crowded out by, the nonsense sprouted by, the mainstream sort of business media, some of these sort of 24/7 business media channels, CNBC, Fox Business Network, the Wall Street Journal, even in Australia, the Australian Financial Review. A lot of the commentary in there is just so unhelpful and so grounded in the shareholder primacy paradigm that it is no wonder that boards and executives are confounded as to what they need to do. So please share it so that we can balance out that commentary. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.